Hi everyone. Let's take a look at the exchange variation of the French defense, which occurs when white exchanges pawns on d5. So after this happens, you can see the pawn structure is perfectly symmetrical. And for this reason, a lot of players believe that this is a boring way for white to play. But boring suits me just fine. If white wants to grant me instant equality, then as the black player, I'm happy. But as black, there are actually a few ways you can mix things up if you want to go for an initiative or an advantage, or if you want to fight. One way is, in some cases, you can push your c-pawn to c5 to unbalance the pawn structure. And after these pawns get exchanged, then you'll be left with an isolated d-pawn, which is a structural weakness, but in exchange, you'll get a lot of activity for your pieces. So sometimes we can do that, and I'll mention exactly when in just a moment. Another way to mix things up is after white castles kingside, we can have a plan to castle queenside. And with opposite side castling, we can attack each other's kings. So that's another good way to mix things up. Now, if you remember only one thing about the exchange French, then this would be it. A nice, safe developing scheme for black in many cases is to put your pawn on c6, getting a nice solid pawn chain here. Develop your dark squared bishop to d6, and then the knight comes behind to e7. Now the reason the knight goes to e7 is because we want to develop our light squared bishop, in many cases, to f5. Sometimes to g4 to pin a knight on f3. But if we put it on f5, then the knight on e7 will support it. And often white will be developing their light squared bishop to d3, and we'd be happy to trade off those light squared bishops because we have a central pawn on a light square. So right now our light squared bishop is the worst bishop of the two. And white's light squared bishop is his better bishop. So we'd be happy to trade those off. And then after developing like that, we can castle kingside, and we have a nice, safe position. So that's probably the one thing you would want to remember if you remember nothing else about the French exchange. But we can sometimes be more ambitious than that. Anyway, in this position, we'll look at the top 3 most common moves for white. And we'll begin with an exciting move, c4. So white immediately strives to unbalance the structure here, and he wants the c-pawn to trade for our d-pawn, and white will be left with the structural weakness, the isolated queen's pawn. But in exchange, white will get a lot of open lines, his bishops will be wide open, and he'll get a lot of piece activity. Okay, in the case of c4, a good plan for black is to develop his kingside in a hurry and castle on that side of the board. And we'll put the knight on its natural square on f6, and then most of the time we'll develop the bishop to b4, which can pin a knight on c3 or can gain a tempo by calling check, and then we'll be ready to castle kingside. So here we'll play knight f6, and then we'll follow a common possible way to play here. Knight f3, bishop b4 check, knight c3, castles. Okay, now this entire time, black is waiting to capture on c4. We don't want to do it here, because if we capture on c4 here, then we're just helping white's light squared bishop develop. So what we're doing is we're waiting to take on c4. We're waiting for white to develop his light squared bishop somewhere, so that when we take on c4, he'll have to recapture with the same bishop, and he will have lost a tempo. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. All right, and the most usual move in this position is indeed to develop that bishop to e2, getting ready to castle kingside, and now's the time to take on c4. So bishop takes c4 is the normal reply. Now we have to develop our other minor pieces. Well, our light squared bishop belongs on g4 or possibly f5. g4 seems more aggressive to me, pinning the knight. Then perhaps castles. Knight c6, putting pressure on that weak, isolated d-pawn. Bishop e3 supporting it. Okay, now here's a plan to keep in mind. We would like to perhaps take the knight on f3, which is defending the d-pawn. And white doesn't want to mess up the kingside structure and recapture with the g-pawn, so white would recapture with the queen, removing a defender of d4. Then it looks like we can gain the pawn by taking with our knight, which attacks the queen at the same time, so white wouldn't have time to do something like pin our knight. Okay, so that looks like a threat, but the problem with that threat is when we draw the white queen to f3, it's going to be attacking our b7 pawn. So while we're taking his d4 pawn, his queen will recapture one of our pawns on b7. So for that reason, we make what may look like a very mysterious move here, but now it makes sense in light of what we just discussed. Rook b8. It's a good idea to keep in mind. Okay, that defends b7, so bringing the queen to f3 doesn't worry us because the queen cannot attack or cannot take the b7 pawn. So in fact, white's in a bit of trouble here because we still have this threat of taking the knight on f3 and then taking the pawn on d4. And so white has to do something passive here, probably bishop e2 to defend the knight. Okay, so the queen can remain as a defender of the d-pawn. Well, that's okay, we're happy with that. And now another thing to keep in mind when you're playing against an isolated d-pawn, two things. One, the square directly in front of the pawn, the one I have marked here, is weak. And that's because no pawns can attack that square. So often we like to occupy it. I would move knight d5 here. And a second thing to keep in mind when playing against an isolated queen's pawn is you would like to exchange as many pieces as you can. Because the closer you get to an endgame, the weaker that isolated pawn becomes, and you might be able to win it. Okay, so that's just a little advice about playing against that isolated queen's pawn. So this is a typical taste of what can happen in this c4 line. Okay, so when white plays c4, that's a typical position. So what else can white play here? Well, a very common move is bishop d3. Okay, keeping the c pawn back, developing the bishop. And now, as I said before, a very safe way for black to play is to play c6, bishop d6, knight e7, castles, and bishop e5, or bishop f5 rather. And the bishop on f5 will be supported by the knight on e7. And black, again, would be happy to trade those light squared bishops. That's a very safe way to play against bishop to d3. But a more ambitious way that I would try is playing c5, doing what white just did to us. We'll do it to white. And I think it's a good time to do that after you see bishop d3, because as you remember, when the colors were flipped, what we did was when white played c4 in this position, we developed our knight to f6, and we put our bishop on b4 with check. But here in this line, after bishop d3, c5, with the colors flipped, white has already developed his light squared bishop. So unless he wants to waste a tempo, it's not going to come to the corresponding square here on b5. So this move c5, makes a little sense here. All right, so what does white do after c5? Well, we'll look at the top two moves. Most common move is simply for white to finish developing his kingside. And we'll put some more pressure on the d4 pawn with knight c6, castles. And now I don't really like the top lines here. I don't really like the rook coming to the e1 square, for example. It's a little difficult to get the plan of development we talked about with the knight on e7 supporting the bishop to f5. So what I would go for here is to move c4, just gaining some space, trying to disrupt white's development. That bishop is pretty well placed on d3. It's stopping one possible square for our light squared bishop, and putting the knight here to support it is a little slow in this case since white is already castled, his rook is coming to e1. So we're going to try to drive his bishop off of this nice diagonal. Okay, common way to follow this up is by calling check before moving the bishop, so this intermezzo. Then we'll block with the dark squared bishop, and now white can retreat his bishop all the way to f1 where it's out of the way of the rook, so the rook still has influence down the e-file. Okay, then we can finish our kingside development. Bishop g5, castle, and this is a fine setup for black. Okay, so going back to this position after we played c5, the second most common move I saw in the Lichess database was a little strange to me. D takes c5. This was played quite a number of times by masters, and it seems to be breaking the rule that white should really not take that pawn until we've developed this bishop so we can gain a tempo. Now this just gives us the opportunity to take back on c5 all in one move. Nevertheless, white does play this. Okay, then knight f3, knight f6, both players can castle, and we'll just look at a sample line here. Knight bd2, knight c6, h3, and so white is keeping our bishop off of the g4 square, but as a result that actually weakens the g3 square. And because of that, there's a maneuver that's worth keeping in mind, and we'll see it again in a Grandmaster game in a few moments. But a move worth keeping in mind is to move queen d6 here. And this is a nice idea. Black is threatening to move the queen to g3 at some point because the bishop here is pinning the f2 pawn. And if the queen gets to g3, then there's more pressure on f2. The pawn on g2 would be pinned. There would be a threat of bishop takes h3 in that case. So this is a nice setup for us as well. Okay, so that's a couple things that could happen if we try to play this c5 move after facing bishop d3. But let's go back and look at the third move that I wanted to look at in this position, which is knight f3. Okay, that's also a very common move. Now, in this case, I don't think c5 makes as much sense as it did after bishop d3. The difference is, with this bishop not yet developed, if we play c5, then white can play bishop b4 check and have that same kind of position we saw that black had with the colors reversed, but white will be a tempo up. So if I was recommending playing that line as black, then I wouldn't want white to have the same line with a tempo up. So if he keeps his bishop back like this and develops the knight first, then we're going to revert back to that nice safe scheme of development, beginning with c6, just getting a nice solid pawn chain here. And now perhaps white can develop his bishop more modestly now to d3 since we've taken away these squares. Bishop d6, we want to get that out of the way of the knight. We want that knight to come to e7. So castles, knight e7, and I'm going to look at two different moves here. Let's begin with the move h3. So h3 is designed to keep our bishop off of the g4 square, which we might play if white doesn't play h3. Even though we were preparing this move bishop to f5 by putting our knight on e7, even in that case, it's sometimes good to put the bishop on g4. It's something to think about. Well, if we see h3, there's a couple of plans I'm going to mention here, two different ways of playing. I don't want to put this bishop on f5 right away because my e file is going to be weak with the king in the center of the board still uncastled. So there's two ways to play here. One is go ahead and castle, get that king off of that dangerous e file, and that's fine, that's a good move. Now keep in mind, anytime you castle as black on the king side in the French defense, there's a tactic you have to watch out for called the Greek gift sacrifice, which would begin with the move bishop takes h7 check. Now here it doesn't work, but it's worth examining why it doesn't work. So if you're unfamiliar with the Greek gift sacrifice, here's the idea. White gives up the bishop, black takes it, and then white calls check with the knight. King falls back, and then white attacks with the queen, threatening a mate on the h7 square. Now the reason it doesn't work here is because, well, black can defend the h7 square with his light square bishop. And so white is just down a piece, and the bishop can even come to g6 next and harass the queen. So black is winning. So it is safe to castle in this position, and then maybe one way for white to play is something like knight b d2, and then we can play our bishop out to f5, supported by our knight. Okay, so backing up, I mentioned that after h3 there's another way to play. Besides castling kingside, another idea is to castle queenside, which looks a little strange. When you look at this position, you see the king side is already prepared for castling. Pieces are out of the way. And on the queen side, there are 3 pieces you still have to get out of the way before you can castle on that side of the board. Well, nevertheless, it is an interesting idea to just develop all your minor pieces, develop your queen to the c7 square, natural place for the queen, and get castled on the opposite side. So you can launch an attack on the white's king's position. And we're going to see a grandmaster game in a few moments where none other than Hikaru Nakamura tried out this plan. Okay, and in order to enact the plan, we would like to develop our light square bishop to the e6 square, and then develop the knight behind it onto d7. But we don't want to put it on e6 yet, because then the move knight to g5 is annoying. So we're going to do what Nakamura did. We're going to play h6 to keep that knight off of g5. Okay, then perhaps rook e1. Now we can play bishop e6, knight b d2, knight d7. Now maybe knight f1 to reroute that knight. It might come to g3 or e3. Queen c7, just looking at a sample here, c3, and then long castles. So it took us a while, but we did castle safely on the queen side. And now we can launch our pawns on the king side, and white will be doing the same over here. And so we get this opposite side castling. So it's far from boring, even though it came from the French exchange. Okay, let's go back to right here after we played knight to e7. So we're still in the middle of our, let's recall, we're still in the middle of our nice safe setup after white played knight f3, we played c6, then white developed the light squared bishop, we played bishop d6, they castled, we played knight e7, intending to support the bishop coming to f5. Now we just looked at what happens if white plays h3, which is a little slow. If I were white, I might try rook e1. So let's take a look at that move. So that immediately puts pressure down the e file. So we're going to get our king out of the way. We're going to castle. Then we'll look at a sample line here, maybe knight bd2. And now I want to mention a couple interesting tactical ideas that you have to be aware of when developing this light squared bishop. For example, developing it to g4, even though white allowed it, white didn't play h3 in this line, is a blunder as marked. Okay, do you see why that's a blunder? What common tactical idea does white have here? Well, white can play bishop takes h7 check and just snatch a pawn. And the point is, if we take the bishop, then knight g5 check unleashes the queen's attack on our light square bishop, winning the piece back. So king g8, queen takes g4. Okay, and white goes up a clean pawn, and white is much better in this position. So that's just something to watch out for when developing that bishop. Be careful if you put it on g4, pinning the knight to the queen. While this bishop is on this diagonal, watch out for that tactic. Okay, so if we don't put it on g4, maybe we'll put it on f5. But even then, we have to kind of think hard and calculate. Can we put it on f5? It turns out we can. That's a fine move. If you want to avoid the line I'm about to show you, there are other things you can do. You can develop this knight, just keep that bishop back in reserve for a while. Or you can even change your plans and put this knight on g6, kind of blocking the effect of that bishop. So there are different things you can do, but bishop f5 is a safe move. However, you have to be aware of this idea. If you play bishop f5, white could try rook takes knight, removing the defender of your bishop, which is now undefended. So we don't want to take that rook, because then white would get two minor pieces for the rook, which is a material gain. So what do? Well, we take the bishop. So we just traded minor pieces. Okay, and our bishop is hanging, his rook is hanging. What does white do here? Well, the engine tells me white's best move is kind of strange looking. It's actually rook takes b7, and that rook might get into a little trouble. You know, it only has one safe square at the moment, which is on b3. But we do have to do something about our bishop. And I like this move, this idea of bishop c4, which also looks strange to me. The idea is, well, you're cutting off that square. Now that rook has no squares to go to. Okay, it's completely trapped. If we can successfully attack it, if we can do something like queen c8, we can win that rook. We can at least win the exchange. Okay. But putting the bishop here on c4, doesn't that allow knight takes bishop? Well, that's okay. If we take back with the pawn, then the pawn is defending the b3 square. Okay, nevertheless, you can explore this further with an engine. This is a perfectly fine way for both players to play. It's about equal, and it's, again, far from boring for an exchange French. All right, so just to review, we looked at three moves in this position. We looked at the move c4, trying to unbalance the position and get that isolated queen's pawn. If we see that, we're just going to develop the king side in a hurry, knight f6, bishop b4, castle king side. Another move here is the move bishop d3. Since white has developed that light squared bishop, and he doesn't want to waste a tempo bringing it to b5 later, this is a good time for us to unbalance the position with c5. And finally, another common move here is knight f3. Now here I do not believe c5 is the best move because of the reply bishop to b5 check. So we're going to go for our safe setup with c6. We're going to plan on bishop to d6, knight to e7, bishop to f5, short castle, or you can do what Nakamura likes and goes for that long castle. All right, so let's see this exchange variation in a couple of Grandmaster games. I want to take a look at a game, Tatai versus Korchnoi from 1978. And so Korchnoi has the black pieces. Let's see how he handles this exchange French. Okay, his opponent plays bishop d3. And just as we recommended, Korchnoi plays c5. Okay, then knight f3, knight c6 pressuring d4. And now we see a move that's different than the theory we just looked at. And I think it's a mistake. Queen e2 check is what Korchnoi's opponent tried. The engine doesn't like that move, and I don't like it either. The queen is misplaced on the e-file. It's going to help black's development. It's easy to block the check and get castled, and black can put a rook on e8 and make the queen move again later. So I don't think that's maybe the best place for that queen. And we're going to see how Korchnoi handles this, in fact, and we will see that queen is definitely misplaced. Okay, so bishop e7 blocks the check. D takes c5. So Korchnoi was perfectly happy blocking with this particular minor piece, even though he cannot recapture on c5. That's a very weak pawn. It's hard to defend. b4 can't defend it because knight takes b4. So Korchnoi can pick up that pawn again later. All right, knight f6, getting ready to castle. h3, a bit of a slow move, but keeping the bishop off of g4. Okay, Korchnoi castles, white castles, and then it's time to take that pawn back. Okay, another very slow move here, and the engine really dislikes this move, c3. I think the point of that move is white sees the rook coming to e8, and he's getting a little nice square to nestle the queen into over here, but it's just too slow. White needs to develop his pieces. The engine suggests the line knight c3 as being much better, rook e8, and queen d1, just acknowledging that putting the queen on e2 was a mistake and just putting it back on its original square. And it's pretty close to equal in this position. Okay, but white tried c3. Now let's see how Korchnoi handles this. He gets the tempo on the queen, rook to e8, queen goes over to c2, and now Korchnoi uses a tactical idea we mentioned earlier. Queen to d6. Do you remember the point of that move? Well, remember this dark squared bishop is pinning the f2 pawn. So that queen can go over to g3. Let's see how it gets there. Okay, white plays knight bd2, allowing the queen to go there right now. And now black is threatening bishop takes h3 since the g2 pawn is pinned. So white's in a lot of trouble here, but he tries bishop to f5 to block the bishop. But Korchnoi responds with rook e2, a very strong continuation here, putting a third attacker on the f2 square, pinning the knight. White's in a lot of trouble here. Not only is there pressure on f2, which I don't know if you can even defend that, but white is just not developed. The knight on d2 cannot move right now, which means that's locking in the dark squared bishop, and those pieces are locking in the a1 rook. And white's king is in a lot of danger. Black's pieces are pointed directly at that king side. Well, white tried knight to d4, okay, and this is attacking the rook, maybe supporting the bishop, blocking the dark squared bishop from attacking f2, but it's a major blunder that hastens the end of the game. Black made one move here and white resigned. Can you think of what it was? Okay, the move that Korchnoi played here was knight takes d4, and white resigned. Okay, black just picked up a piece, and there's a couple of things we have to think about here. When white put the knight on d4, another thing he was doing was he was threatening the black queen because that pawn is no longer pinned. Well, after taking the knight, can't white still take the queen? Well, no, because white's queen is hanging. So black takes back with check, going up a piece and threatening the rook on a1. So white's just going to lose too much material in this line. Black can trade these bishops, take on a1, and white is up a knight and a rook. Okay, so taking the queen doesn't work. What else could white have tried here? Well, let's see what happens if he takes the knight. Okay, if he takes the knight, then we have bishop takes d4. Okay, still putting pressure on f2. And then maybe the engine says queen d3 is an attempt here. There's no way to defend f2. There's nothing white can do to defend that square. So white tries to get the queen into the action here, still defending the f5 bishop, attacking the rook on e2. But then bishop takes f2 check, king h1, rook e3, attacking the queen, queen c2, bishop takes f5, queen takes back, and then the rook returns to e2, putting a lot of pressure on the g2 point here. And so black is up a couple of pawns, white is still undeveloped, and there's a lot of pressure on that king, and the engine says black is simply winning. Okay, so nice miniature from Korchnoi, illustrating some important tactical ideas. So let's look at one more Grandmaster game. Okay, this one was played in 2007, and the white player was Tigran L. Petrosian, no relation to the world champion Tigran V. Petrosian. Okay, his father, Tigran L. Petrosian's father, did name him Tigran after the world champion. And interestingly, they're both from Armenia, the world champion and the player of this game. Black was played by Nakamura. This was played in 2007, and it was actually a blitz game in a strong tournament on ICC. So let's see how Nakamura handles the exchange variation of the French. Okay, here white played knight f3. So let's look at this line here. Nakamura did play what we recommended, c6, bishop d3, bishop d6, castles, knight e7, just as we talked about with our slow, safe plan. Okay, maybe supporting the bishop coming to f5, but we'll see what Nakamura does. After h3, as I mentioned earlier, Nakamura doesn't go for kingside castling here. He wants to play more aggressively, makes sense, that's in his character. He played h6. Remember, the point of that was to keep the knight off of g5, so that after black puts the bishop on e6, it cannot be attacked by that knight. Okay, knight bd2, knight d7, knight f1, queen c7, c3, castles. So we talked about this same sequence of 11 moves earlier. Let's see how the game progresses from here. So with opposite side castling, both sides want to launch their pawns at the other's king. So white loses no time, starts right away by pushing b4. Okay, black plays g5, knight 3 h2. So what black is threatening here is g4, and with the knight sitting on f3, that means the g file is going to open, because either the knight moves away and the black pawn takes the h pawn, or white takes the g pawn and then black takes back and opens the g file. So with this kind of configuration, pushing the pawn forward is going to open that g file. So white tries bringing that knight back to h2. Okay, and then rook dg8, putting the rooks on the files that are anticipated to be open soon. a4, h5, supporting the pawn push further, g4, b5. That's not really a threat. B takes c6 can be easily handled. g4. And now that the knight is not on f3, this does give white the opportunity to push his pawn forward, keeping the g file closed. But then g3. Okay, we have that same situation. There's the knight and there's the pawn. So something's got to give here. The g file is going to open after all. White decides to go ahead and take the pawn. And now, instead of recapturing, okay, Nakamura brings another piece closer to the action, knight to f5. Bishop g5, interesting move blocking the effect of the rook. Okay, knight takes g3, b takes c6, queen takes c6, keeping the pawn where it is on b7. Knight takes g3, bishop takes back, Rook e3 attacking the bishop, Queen c7 defending it, Knight f1 attacking it again, and now the bishop goes to f4, okay, defended by the queen. White exchanges bishops, plays Queen f3, offers a queen exchange, but Nakamura declines and instead snatches up a pawn. Okay, so now Black is up a pawn in the position. White's attack on Black's king seems to have fizzled out, but he pushes his pawn forward anyway. Rook h6, maybe planning on putting the rook on f6 or g6 if that bishop moves out of the way. a6, b6, keeping things closed. White offers a queen exchange again, and now Nakamura says, okay, I'm a pawn up, I have the better position, I'll exchange queens and go into a favorable endgame. Then knight f6, knight h2, we'll go through the rest of the game pretty quickly. Nakamura centralizes his king. He plays rook c8, hits the pawn on c3, rook c1 defends, knight e4 check. Minor pieces get exchanged, rook goes to f4, attacking the e-pawn, which gets defended. Okay, knight f1, king e7, bringing the king around to the king side, knight e3, blockading the passed pawn, king f6, g3, king g5. So the king is nicely placed defending the isolated pawn, maybe freeing up this rook to move around. c4. White's pair of pawns here does look pretty good. Okay, bishop d7, getting out of the way of those pawns. Rook h1, b5, c takes b5. So Black temporarily sacrifices that pawn, but this is a very weak pawn and easy to recover. Black plays rook b8, attacking it for a second time. Okay, he does not want to take back with the bishop. Do you see why? Yeah, that bishop was defending this pawn here. So that's why I called that a temporary pawn sacrifice, because he doesn't immediately recapture. He plays rook b8, and now White makes a blunder in the position. Black actually has the favorable position here, but White makes it easy. He plays rook b1. Now, that defends the pawn because, again, this bishop is tied down to the defense of f5. So, for example, if rook takes, then rook takes, bishop takes back, then rook takes this pawn with check. Well, why was that a blunder then? Can you see the tactic Nakamura has? Yes, Nakamura played rook takes a6, the pawn is pinned. Okay, d5, rook to a2 check, Black's rooks are coming into the game, king g1, rook a3 hitting the knight, king f2, rook c8 getting the other rook into the action, rook b2, rook c3, attacking the knight again. Knight moves out of the way. Okay, attacking the pawn, offering a trade of rooks. Rook c2, rook takes b5. So Black has up 2 pawns at the moment. Rook c7 hitting the bishop. Black is up 3 pawns while defending the bishop. Knight comes in, rook d2 check. King e1, attacking the rook. So if we take the knight, he gets the rook. Okay, but then rook d3, attacking the knight again. And White decides to take the bishop, and Black could take the rook and be up in exchange, but he thinks this is better, taking the knight instead. King goes here, rook takes g3, and White resigned. He's had enough, he's down 4 pawns. Okay, so we can see that the exchange variation can get exciting. It is not always boring. I hope you learned something from the video I made. I learned a lot by making it. All right, thanks for watching.